Hello, everybody. Here we are at another episode of Magic, Creativity, and Life. And I'm Thorn Coyle. And what is my news this week? Well, I am still working on my Stars of Power book and the revised 20th anniversary edition of Evolutionary Witchcraft. I also just returned from teaching at the Sacred Space Conference in Baltimore, or just outside of Baltimore. It's a terrific conference, and the next one will actually be a joint conference with Between the Worlds, and that is one of my favorite combinations. The teaching is just fantastic. The rituals are really good. Everyone who is there to learn and to share, which I appreciate. So you can look that up, Sacred Space Between the Worlds. That will be in February next year. The other thing is I'm getting ready to launch a Kickstarter for my book, The Winding Road, which is contemporary fantasy based loosely on the Thomas the Rhymer ballad. And you can go follow that on Kickstarter right now. I'd really appreciate it if you would. That way you get notified upon launch. So that brings me to today's interview. I'm interviewing two truly amazing people, Rodney Orpheus and Phil Hine. They're both magicians, pagans, creative folks, magic workers who've known each other for decades. And you'll get a sense of that during this very wild and woolly podcast. I had to rein them in a couple times. It was a lot of fun. They're both characters and very interesting, and I got a lot out of it, and I think you might too. There's a lot in there about magical history, politics, and the importance of magic in the creative process. So thanks again for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing to my podcast. And thanks, as always, to those of you who support this podcast on my Patreon. I appreciate you. Let's dive in. Hello, welcome back to another episode of Magic, Creativity, and Life. My name is Thorn Coyle, and today in the studio I have two guests, Rodney Orpheus and Phil Hine. Rodney Orpheus was born in Ireland and started in the music business in the late 80s as lead singer and songwriter of the Cassandra Complex, who scored multiple #1 records in the alternative charts. After moving to Hamburg, Germany, he became a record producer and worked with software company Steinberg on the groundbreaking virtual studio technology system, which has become one of the foundations of modern music technology. He is the author of Abrahadabra, Understanding Aleister Crowley's Thelemic Magic, and Grimoire of Aleister Crowley. He currently lives in Los Angeles, California, working as a software designer and music producer, and continues to record and tour with the Cassandra Complex. And Phil Hine has been a practicing occultist for over 45 years, with a career spanning Wicca, ritual magic, chaos magic, and non-dual tantra. Together with Rodney Orpheus, he co-created and edited the UK's first monthly pagan magazine, Pagan News. His books include Condensed Chaos, The Pseudonomicon, Acts of Magical Resistance, Querying Occultures, and many, many others. In 2019, he founded Twisted Trunk, a small press specializing in publishing translations of rare tantric texts. Forthcoming publications are Yoginis, Sex, Death, and Possession in Early Tantra, and Yogis Behaving Badly. Phil and Rodney, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
It's my pleasure too.
Okay, that's Rodney.
I'm the one with a kind of Yorkshire, Lancashire accent.
And I'm the West Coast U.S. voice. Just so listeners know, I severely condensed all of your amazing accomplishments. And your amazing accomplishments bring me to my first question. What do you consider to be your creative roots? Were you doing music? Were you writing? Were you dancing? Were you doing theater? Were you painting? What were your creative interests in your younger years? And why don't you start, Phil?
Okay, well, thinking back to my mid-20s, actually, I was studying drama therapy at college. And, I came across a book by this guy called Keith Johnston. I don't know if you've come across him, Thorn. He's he does improv theatre, and I actually did a course with him, but he did this brilliant book called Impro, and Impro was all about improvisation drama. It was funny, it was challenging, and it was deeply autobiographical. And I thought, wow, this is a really good way to write, because I think, when you start off as a writer, you kind of carry on the habits you've already ingrained. And
right,
I learned to write essays at school and then at college, and I read a lot of occult books, which, quite frankly, during the 70s and early 80s, stodgy. The authors write like the bums are stuffed full of horsehair. It's all very factual, and you get no sense of the person behind the writing. It's all do this, do that, blah, 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 and there's no sense of the person coming through. And Keith Johnson's book was the first book that really hit me, that you got a sense of him as a developing person who had his own take on things, who was provocative and challenging and very, very funny. And I thought, this is a really good way to write. And it took me a while, but I think that book kind of like pushed me to develop my own writing style.
That is really cool. And it also makes me wonder, did that book also help you with your ritual arts?
Very much so, because I as I said, I was studying drama therapy. And at the time I was in this Wiccan coven, and I was coming back from drama therapy classes going, this stuff is great, we should do some of this. And they were all going, oh, it's not part of our tradition. I think they were a bit scared by it because it wasn't occult. A lot of occultists in that period that I encountered wouldn't take any notice of something if it wasn't, I don't know, arranged around the Tree of Life. Or later on painted back and arranged around the Chaos Sphere. It wasn't occult, so they didn't take any notice of it. And I got heavily into drama therapy and improv and group dynamics. And during the late 80s, I did a lot of ritual mask work, for example, that was very much rooted in Keith Johnson's approach to improv. And then when I started doing magical workshops, again, I drew as much on my experiments in improvisation, theatre and drama as I did on magical stuff. And quite often, I was taking improv exercises and just kind of like dressing them up with a bit of occult glitter, if you like.
Right.
So, yeah, it was a big influence in many ways.
That's terrific. I also have a theater background and I was like, this is a great use of my skills, right? Because it really helps both in speaking and presenting and teaching, but also in ritual magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And so it's interesting that all of us have a bit of a performance background. Of course, Rodney, you've been performing for decades. So how about your creative roots?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a writer from the moment I could read, which was about something like 3 years old. And that's what I wanted. As soon as I discovered there was such a thing as books, I wanted to write books. It was that simple. Mm-hmm. And then in my teenage years, I got really into music and really enjoyed music a lot, but never wasn't particularly musical. I came from a very poor rural background, where you didn't get music lessons, that's for sure. I mean, you were out working in the fields at 12 years old. But and then, but I was really into music. And then one day when I was at school at lunch break, I went to the local newsagents and picked up a music magazine. And in that music magazine, they had the cover of a punk fanzine. It was like the punk era. And it had 3 guitar chords on the cover, like EA and the headline. And then it said, now form a band. And I looked at that and was like, I can do that. So I bought myself a cheap electric guitar, secondhand for $25, learned those 3 chords, wrote a song and formed a band. And that was that.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Just that simple. And then I thought, I can be a musician. This is great. And then I'm like, well, do I want to be a writer? Do I want to be a musician? And I thought, well, I'm like in my late teens. I like girls. I can either have the choice of staying at home for the rest of my life alone in a darkened room or going on stage and meeting lots of cute girls. And the choice was fairly easy after that.
And then you became a writer anyway.
Yeah. So it was all good.
Yeah. Yeah, that is cool. Yeah, I also started working around age 13, not in the fields. I was not raised rural, but raised working class poor. But I managed to find a way into the arts anyway, even though my family was like kind of confused by that and are still, I think, confused by that. Yeah. You've written a book together. Why don't you tell me about, what's the title of that book?
It's called Delinquent Elementals, which was the title because we couldn't think of a better one. It's from one of the articles in the book. Well, how the book wrote, we haven't really written the book as, well, we did write a lot of the new stuff is new in it, but basically, the new book, Delinquent Elementals, it's a compilation of the best of all the pagan news articles that we ran over many, many, many years in the late 80s, early 90s when we worked together. And
1992.
And then so during COVID or just before COVID, I'd moved to London again, and where Phil was living, and we got together after many, many, many years, and we're like, hey, we did some amazing stuff there that no one's ever heard of.
Right.
Wouldn't it be great if other people could see it now? So we started into this thing that became this 656-page magnum opus, which was the best of pagan news. And then COVID hit while we were doing it, so we spent loads of time really expanding it and writing loads of new footnotes and explanatory articles around it. And so the book is like about 2/3 of it's the original material, and about 1/3 of it, I would say, is new material that conceptualizes it.
It's it's the story of pagan news, and how we started it and what it was like to do a zine every 3 weeks on a budget of basically zero.
Right.
It was very punk rock.
I was just going to say, it's the three chords.
Exactly. It was exactly that attitude. Yes. Yeah. It was, we had a cheap Atari ST computer that I had for my music, and a laser printer that fell off the back of a lorry.
Right.
A very expensive
one that we certainly couldn't afford. That came to us through various nefarious means, and we sat
magical means. We did a
ritual, and then the next day, some guy turned up and saying, "Hey, do you want a laser printer?" Back in the days when laser printers were really expensive,
right?
But you must remember the photocopier that turned up first.
Right. That's right. We've got a photocopier out of nowhere as well. So it was all run on,
which was completely useless.
Run on a complete shoestring and literally run on a hope and a prayer, very literally. And then we were sitting in a little tiny attic room in a suburb of Leeds in Yorkshire, knocking this thing out every few weeks.
Every 3 weeks.
And then every Sunday we would buy all the Sunday papers, and we'd sit around and spread them all across the living room floor of the house that I and my girlfriend were sharing at the time. And we would spend the whole afternoon just going through all the newspapers and magazines and finding interesting stories and going through all the letters we had and the things that people had sent us. And we would, we had a big whiteboard of what would be in the latest issue, what was coming in the next issue, and everything else. And we ran it very professionally, even though it was completely amateurish.
We did, and many years later, I spent 15 years working in a large media company producing magazines, and that experience of doing pagan news was a great help in organisation.
Yeah. We even won awards for pagan news in the.
We did, from a computer magazine, actually.
Still, that's amazing. I love the punk ethos and the DIY quality. But I also love your creative persistence, right? And there's something about that attitude that people who end up having longevity in creative careers, I think, need that. We're just going to sit down and do this thing because we want to do it and we can do it. And we're not waiting for someone to tell us we can do it. We're just seizing permission. And
because other people told us we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't be able to do it.
That was always one of the greatest motivations when people say, you can't do it like that.
Yeah.
And we were like, and we very deliberately, when we started out from the very beginning, we had a little manifesto of what we were going to do or what we weren't going to do. We knew what we didn't want, and we described this in the intro of the book is like, one of the things it was called pagan news because it was news, it was newsy. And that meant we had to do it every month because most pagan magazines were coming out on whenever they felt like it. Was every 6 months or 9 months or, whatever. And news is only new news when it's new. So that meant that we had to put it out very regularly, very fast. We wanted a really fast turnaround.
And it had to be short and punchy. I mean, we didn't want 3,000 words about the use of the semicolon in the witchcraft laws.
Yeah, I mean, in most pagan magazines,
turgid like that. It had to be news. It had to be punchy. It had to be funny. It had to. Well, we upset a lot of people.
It had to be very. We were very sarcastic, and we still are. We were
about everybody.
Everybody. We unashamedly embraced bitchcraft.
Right.
But in a really loving way. That was the thing. We really appreciated the whole community in a very wide way. So we were equal opportunity bitchy about everyone. But we wanted to, because we loved it so much. And we took great pride in that. in the fact that we had such a very wide coverage of topics. We would have everything from Wicca to Satanism to the Temple of Psychic Youth to comic books to UFOs, you name it. We would put it in there. If we thought it was interesting and funny, it was in there.
Yeah, except poetry.
No pagan poetry. That was an old thing.
No pagan poetry, because it's mostly terrible.
Though we did end up Barry Hairbrush. We had a third member called who was a friend of ours. People always thought that Barry Hairbrush was a pseudonym for us because it was the funniest things in the magazine were these cartoons and stories by Barry Hairbrush. So they thought it was us under a pseudonym to try and obscure the fact we were doing this, but it wasn't. It was actually another person who has, up until all the way through for 40 years, he's remained completely anonymous because we swore to him we would never reveal his real name. So he's still just called Barry Hairbrush, but he was like the invisible third member who did a lot of the humor stuff.
Definitely.
And he was allowed to do pagan poetry because his poetry was absolutely hilarious. But that was, no pagan poetry, no illustrations of elven women riding unicorns across a flowing brook or whatever, and none of that nonsense. No, we didn't want any of that crap.
So, in revisiting that material, what effect did that have on you? It's got to be wild looking at stuff you wrote and compiled decades and decades ago, and then trying to contextualize it for contemporary times, because the world is quite different now, right? And I love that you wrote some new material. So I'm just wondering about that process. What was the process of doing this compilation?
Something William Burroughs once said to me was that, occasionally you'll look back at stuff you wrote years ago and find it so awful you want to rip it up and throw it into somebody else's bin. Largely, I think most of the stuff we wrote for Pagan News and our contributors wrote, it's interesting because it's contextualized a very interesting period of British occultism when things were exploding in all directions.
Right.
It certainly honed my writing abilities because I had to be very concise and, you've got 300 words to explain this concept, don't go over that limit.
We edited ruthlessly.
And I think
each other and
everyone else. A lot of occult stuff is actually, well, I hate to say it, but it's kind of timeless. Like one of the things Barry Hairbrush did was this famous occult stereotypes, and that was done in the 80s, and you can still see those. The stereotypes he was taking the piss out of, they're still around.
Yeah, somebody was telling me that the other day. He said he was reading and saying like what he found so amazing about the book was that it was so timeless, and a lot of the stuff we were satirizing is still there and still the same targets.
Yeah.
And you can still recognize the same people we were satirizing.
There's still, we had people like Grevington, Gore, Crowley Ball. Crowley Balls are still around. I mean, there's fucking loads of them on Twitter. And the creepy guy who likes initiating young girls with big bosoms into his witchcraft coven where they were skyclad, Those characters are still around. A lot of the people who wrote for Pagan News have gone on to become really famous or dead, or in fact both. So I think it's nice for people who are fans of those people now to see some of their early writings.
Absolutely.
That's very cool.
And to look at the news of the stuff that was happening in the 1980s.
Yeah, we were kind of lucky, and I use that word very advisedly, in that when we started literally just as the Satanic Panic was starting. And, and we were actually, I got a modem, and one of the very first early modems, and managed to hook it up to the internet through also various nefarious means, which was by no means easy back then. And we started browsing, US bulletin boards.
It's the bulletin boards, wasn't it? Yeah.
And stuff like that. And we ended up logging into like Christian Satanic Panic bulletin boards. So we were had advanced knowledge of what was going to happen, just as it went from the US to the UK, and it was very big in the UK at the time. And everyone ran for cover. Everyone in the occult scene ran, and I don't blame them because the Satanic Panic was horrific and evil and scary.
Yeah.
And a lot of people today don't know anything about that period. But we were being young and ballsy and not having families to worry about, decided to grab the bull by the horns and really go for it. So we were the first people that really fought back, like hardcore. So every issue we would feature in-depth articles about what was happening in the Satanic Panic, what the Christian lunatics were doing and trying to do. We were also the very first people to say, hey, you know, the reason they're doing this is because the Christian priests themselves are the ones doing the sexual abuse, and this is a giant cover-up. And we got into shitloads of trouble because we hammered the whole the way through.
Yeah. We totally refuse to buy into that.
It's evil Satanists.
It's not the nice pagans who are doing it. It's the nasty pagans over there. It's the OTO or the black witches, you know, who sacrifice.
There were far too many people chickens, at the time started pointing fingers like, hey, we're nice Wiccans. It's those evil Satanists over there, which we thought was just absolutely, well, two things. One, it was morally reprehensible. And two, it was also, from a political point of view, completely self-defeating, because you were just buying into and reinforcing the nonsense they were spreading. So we fought very, very strongly against it and became very well known for it.
Lost us a few subscribers.
Yeah, because I mean, we took great pleasure in every time you would see like a news report of some politician or whatever, we'd see a copy of Pagan News on their desk. You know, we'd see Pagan News.
Wow.
We talked about on the radio. So we became like very notorious almost for presenting the other side of the story, which I'm very proud of.
Well, and it strikes me as so timely that you're releasing this book now, given our current conditions, you know, socially and politically, where everyone's running to throw a lot of other people under the bus right now to try to protect themselves. And it's not working. It's only getting worse for everyone. And of course, you know, I'm talking about the U.S., but it's global, as we know. Yeah, so it's very, very timely. When does the book release?
It's out now.
It's out now.
Available. Yeah. You can buy it directly from Strange Attractor, the publishers.
Yeah. I think global distribution isn't until later in April.
Yeah, I think it's mid-April. I think you can already pre-order it on Amazon and various other non-corporate conglomerates. Please do.
Great. So by the time this podcast airs, people will be able to get it.
And they should, because it's awesome.
That's great.
I think people have pre-order it will be able to get it already, I think. I keep looking at it and going... Yeah,
I know, it's a beautiful book. You know? I mean...
they're really, really... We had some, let's say, design hiccups because I used to do magazine design. I kind of like stuck my oar in and said, well, why don't you do this and
we spent a lot of time.
They changed it, and we're a lot happier with it now.
We went back and forth literally for, must have been at least 2 years, just on design.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to get it absolutely... It was very frustrating because it could have been out years ago, but we wanted to get it absolutely right. We wanted to make it perfect. And it really looks fabulous.
Yeah, they've really got it, you know, because it was a zine, it has to look visually appealing. It's not just a book. So we kind of like got them to zine it up. And they got this guy in called Grant Abel, and he redid a lot of the crappy Atari clip art we used to use. And in fact, there was one piece of clip art we used to use, which was Mickey Mouse. And we were told, you can't use that nowadays because you'll get sued by Disney.
But ironically,
obviously at the time,
Mickey Mouse just went out of copyright a couple of weeks ago. So...
Well, there you go. But, you know, back in the days when we couldn't use artwork apart from the odd bit of clip art, it was okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or rather, we didn't give a toss about that.
We just went for it.
Occasionally we get a threatening letter from somebody's lawyer.
which immediately went into immediately became, we had a letters page at the back of the magazine.
Yeah.
And we always had a section, my favorite section of the magazine was Star Letter. We would take the most bitchy, any legal threats or any bitchcraft or anything where people, and always my favorite was when people would start a letter with, I know you're not going to print this, but that immediately meant it was going to get printed.
Yeah. What was it? This fanzine is nothing more than the wild ravings of anarchists.
Yeah, and we were like, yep, Star Letter.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Right away.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about both creative and spiritual practice and how they come together in your lives, because clearly they do. You both have long-term creative and magical careers. So Rodney, currently, what do you feel are your core creative and spiritual practices that are helping you these days?
Well, I'm still, excuse me, I'm literally rehearsing for a tour that starts on Saturday. With the Cassandra Complex, we've been on the road for the last year. We've done, I think by the time finishing, which is in about 3 weeks' time, it'll be 49 shows in 13 countries this year, over the last year. So yeah, that's definitely one of the core creative practices I'm doing, is playing a lot of live concerts.
Right.
Which are also very much part of what I would consider my spirituality playing on stage. I mean,
Right.
I've always approached it from a very magical, shamanic point of view. And anyone who's seen us play live,
Mm-hmm.
no, shut up, Phil. Yeah,
Shamanic
whatever.
run.
We always bitch about each other as well. It's like it's been going on this way for 40. Anyway, we keep each other very grounded. So yeah, that's very much what I do. I mean, is a hell of a lot of music from a more. My more magical practice. I mean, I was in the OTO for 29 years, I think. So I've been a
Yeah.
hardcore Thelemite for a long, long time. But I've also been involved with a lot of African diaspora, like voodoo and Santeria, very big interests of mine. I used to spend a lot of time out in New Orleans with Sally Glassman's voodoo temple there.
Right.
That's really where my big interests lie, and always have done for a long time.
So when you're on stage performing, creatively and spiritually, what do you feel? What's the sense? What happens to you? Because sometimes, I mean, when I go to concerts, often there are bands I consider to be like going to temple, and there are other bands that are just fun.
Sure.
Right. And so for me as a participant, I can tell the difference. And so as a magical act and as a transformative act, what's that like for you? What do you feel? What do you see?
That's a really good question. That's a great question. I mean, obviously people come to be entertained. People want a good night out. Nobody spends
Right.
like, $20 or whatever to have a bad time. And so there's a responsibility to make sure that when people give you, I live off the money they give me. So I have a responsibility to give them something back. And I'm very aware of that. So
Right.
it's got to be an entertaining show. But at the same time, to me, that's never been enough. It's never, and it's the same with pagan, all the way back to Pagan News. It was a very entertaining magazine, and it was very funny and very interesting, and we wanted to entertain people. But at the same time, that's not enough. There has to be more to that. You've got to educate and inform as well. So we're very political in what we do, and we're always talking about political subjects. And we're entertaining, and we have a huge laser show and videos running and all the rest of it. The videos are often very political, but also very often very spiritual. And that's the third sort of leg of the whole thing, in the sense that, I mean, for me, every song is written from an emotional place, from some emotional event that was obviously very meaningful enough for me to want to write a song about it. So my ultimate aim then is to evoke that same emotional state in the audience, or an analogous emotional state, so that they can feel what I was feeling. And to me, that's always one of the most amazing moments in a human relationship, is when you can look at somebody and you know that they can feel what you feel. It's a very rare thing, but it's really important. It's the essence of the ultimate, human connection, if you like. God, I'm getting so pretentious here, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And so there's always an attempt to evoke that level of emotional and spiritual depth in the people around me, and make that connection with them. When I look into the audience and I see some little girl standing in the front row, and there's big tears rolling down her face or whatever, and it's like, yes, she gets this, and I've managed to make some kind of connection there, and also take that to a place where it can become transcendent, where it stops becoming about pain or whatever, and it becomes about transcending that level of emotion into a shared spiritual state. Does that make any sense? Does that make sense?
It does make sense to me. And I'm also considering that it has to start within you, though,
yes.
Right? The connection, you're the conduit, right? And so if you're not spiritually connected and creatively connected, you're not going to offer that transmission to the audience. It's going to be fake.
Yeah, and a lot of bands, it is fake. I mean, there's a lot of acts out there that are just faking it all the time, and people still like it, and that's fine if that's what they do. But it's not enough for me. It has to have the authenticity.
That's interesting. About it. Yeah. And so, Phil, is your current primary creative expression still writing? Is that what you consider?
It is writing, but I also do lectures.
Right.
And a lot of my writing actually starts out as a lecture. And what will happen is I'll do loads of research, probably too much. Most of it will end up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, right.
I'll read it to my girlfriend Maria, and she'll say, "That's really terrible. Nobody wants to hear about that." just cut it all out, and maybe one or two other people. And eventually I'll get something that I'm happy with, and I'll go to Treadwell's Bookshop or another venue in London and do a lecture. And that's very much a performance for me. So writing and performing are really big things for me as well. Now, as for my practice, it's very simple. I go for a walk every day. I live in South London. We're very close to a woodland area and a big park. In fact, the park is the Horniman Museum that used to be owned by the Horniman family. Gregor Mathers, Annie Horniman, Gordon Dawn, all that stuff. I either go there every day or I go into our local woods. And that's my practice. I might do a walking meditation where I just kind of like notice everything around me, or if I can't be bothered, I'll listen to some music. And it's very simple. I often do, and I'll use that space to reflect on things that I'm struggling with if I'm writing, or so like today I was thinking, what the hell am I going to talk to Thorn and Rodney about? And I was kind of like starting to churn ideas over in my head. So I use that couple of hours every day as a kind of free space. And then if I'm doing a lecture that I like to entertain, like Rodney says, I like to connect with people. One of the things I'll always try and do is kind of like fix on somebody in the audience and try and get them to laugh. Because if somebody, laughs at what you're saying, that means you've made it. That's my kind of like criteria for having made a connection with somebody, is getting a chuckle out of them,
Right.
Either that or shocking them senseless, which I have seen people respond to it. Things I've come out with during a lecture. I was doing a lecture a few years ago it was part of a series about the chakras, which is where my book on chakras came from. And I was talking about Jung's approach to chakras, and I quoted Jung saying something really anti-Semitic. And there were people in the audience who'd never heard of that side of Jung before, and they were kind of about told. There was this woman her mouth was hanging open. She'd never heard about anything about Jung being anti-Semitic or racist. So I was kind of glad to educate her on that point. But mostly, I like to entertain people. It's about making them laugh, getting them interested, maybe exposing them to something they've not come across before. So a lot of my work is very much about taking things that are not in the occult mainstream, that are a bit off to one side, people or events or concepts that have kind of like slipped under the radar.
Right.
And that's very much what I want to do. I want to bring that obscure stuff into the light and say, hey, look, this stuff's really interesting. You should try and find out some more about it. And here's what I think,
Yeah. Have you always been extra curious, Phil?
Yeah, I think curiosity is... one of the few things that Pete Carroll has ever said that I actually agree with is that I'm sick of occult ideas that pass from book to book without any intervening thought. And that's a really good phrase because, I find as I get older, I'm more and more of a curmudgeon. I question things, things that I just accepted as valid when I was a neophyte, if you like. I now question and I start poking at it, That's what I really like to do.
Yeah,
curiosity. Take things that are accepted and just go, no, that's, poke at it.
Curiosity is something that I keep returning to. And whenever I find myself getting stuck, I invoke curiosity again. And it really keeps me going, especially as I age, I think. And I think as people age, sometimes we lose curiosity. And I think it's more important to increase our curiosity about each other, about the world.
I very much agree. I mean, you have to keep on asking questions.
Yeah.
And keep on, people often say to me, which of your books do you think is the best one? And I usually say, well, probably the next one, actually.
Yeah, right. Right.
I want to be improving all the time. And I don't want to be... And another thing I get is, why didn't you stop writing books about chaos magic? Because I was bored. And why do you
and how many books do you need me to write on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I said what I wanted.
Way too many.
And I moved on. There's way too many books that just recycle the same old turgid crap,
Yeah.
Well, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, so I want to get back to walking practice is also important to me spiritually and creatively. I mean, I do other spiritual practices on a daily basis. I do candle lighting, I do meditation and breath and energy work. But my daily walk, if I don't get that in, it's harder for me to get into the creative flow, right? There's something about the perambulation process that cycles things through me. And yes, it does expand my thinking. It gives me ideas. It makes me notice the world too. Writers, sometimes we can get too self-insular, and taking that walk reminds me, no, there's a world out there, right? So it becomes a form of both magic and creativity for me.
Where's the line between the two?
Right.
Concepts like I don't really get. When people talk about spirituality, I'm very tempted to say, well, what do you mean by that? Because it's a kind of word that means very little to me. Spirituality, magic, creativity, they're all kind of like...
It's life.
Yeah.
It's just... Yeah, life, getting on with it. Whether you be doing like, I don't know, a 16-hour ritual to the gods, or bringing out a pagan magazine every 3 weeks.
Yeah, right. So in that case, what is your current working definition of magic?
Oh God, I don't think I really have one. I've come down to what's become important for me, and I think Rodney will resonate with this, is that it's whatever engages you emotionally, whether it be listening to music, watching him prance about on stage, watching a really crappy film about a dog that dies at the end and getting all weepy about it, which I often do, or, going to the top of the hill at night and calling on the great old ones. For it to mean anything, I think it has to give you a sense of emotional engagement with the world, with other people, and it has to give you a sense of purpose and agency. And those are my two strong things, I think, regardless of whether it actually does have any tangible results, it's the feeling that you have some control of your life. And I think particularly for people who are marginalised because of their class or race or gender identity, that feeling I can have some agency of my circumstances, I think is central.
Yeah. How about you, Rodney? What's your current working definition?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Phil said whatsoever, except that I'm which makes a nice change. No, except that I disagree with everything he said. No, I'm very practically oriented. I mean, I go back to Crowley's definition of magic as a science and art of causing change in accordance with the will. I don't think it's enough to just have to feel you have agency. I want to actually do shit. I want to have the agency. I want to change things. And to me, it needs to be something that is both emotionally transcendent and connecting with the outside of me. It's the opposite of being solipsistic, in that it's something that allows me to transcend the parameters of being an individual and become part of the great universe outside, but also having the ability to change that and make shit happen. And that's really important to me in that sense. Again, it's a pretty wide open definition in that sense. I mean, turning on a light switch is causing change in accordance with my will. So it's literally magical. I don't know how many people know how a light bulb works, but
how many wicks does it take to change a light bulb? We actually had a light bulb joke contest.
Yes, I do. We had a magical light bulb joke contest in Pagan News. It's in the book. But anyways, but that's my working definition. It needs to give me the ability to change the environment around me and become more connected to it. That to me is magic. It's like Sam. I'm a very practical, down to earth guy. I want shit to happen.
Yeah. Well, and you both talked about connection, right? Connection being a primary component, which I agree. I need to be connecting with something inside me and outside of me, right? But I also, my definition of will is intention and action, right? So I want to be consciously engaged. It's not enough to just flip the light switch by rote, by habit, right? To me, habitual behavior is not magic unless I am consciously entraining myself towards an end.
Yeah, I mean, I think training magical behavior to become habitual is a really important thing. I mean, in my first book, I have a chapter called Everyday Magic, which is literally about that very thing, where you take them with simple things and you imbue them with a magical meaning to them, and then you learn them inside yourself so that it becomes completely unconscious. In the same way you learn to play a musical instrument,
or you get up on stage and you're just there. You don't have to.
You don't think about it.
Fret about it or
anything. It just happens through you.
Just go for it.
Yeah.
Well, you are now embodying the
Correct.
practice,
Yes.
right? The practice is no longer outside of you. I think it's why these days my magical practice is so much simpler, just like my creative practice is so much simpler, because I've trained and trained for decades, right?
Yeah, and I think someone
Yeah.
that should point out is that in all of what we just talked about, there is no mention of any concept of divinity whatsoever, which I think
Right.
to some people would find that very peculiar, because they would assume that there has to be, that it's some kind of devotion to gods or goddesses or whatever. Whereas, I mean,
Hey, I'm really into deities,
Sorry?
actually, Rodney. I'm really into goddesses.
yeah,
and
no,
gods.
gods are great, but we don't do it for them.
But you're not,
Yeah,
and that's
I'm an
okay.
atheist.
I fully get that
I'm
perspective.
a complete atheist, but I'm prepared to
Yeah.
like in the same way when I see E.T. phoning home, I know it's a guy in a rubber suit. I know R2D2 is a guy inside a suit, but it doesn't stop me crying when E.T. phones home. Yeah,
That's the
it's still
important thing, I
E.T.
think.
The concept of
Yeah.
he's still an extraterrestrial and a guy in a suit, both simultaneously.
Yeah. I mean, I also relate to deity, to gods and goddesses, and I have practices, and I'm not an atheist, but I'm agnostic, because I don't know exactly what they are, right? I connect with them. I have results from connecting with them. I have a relationship, and yet I'm not a true believer, and I never have been, and never have been. I was as a child, but I never will be.
Absolutely.
Right?
I don't even know that belief is that important.
Absolutely. Belief isn't
Yeah.
important. Belief is the problem,
It
not
isn't
the
important
solution.
at all.
Yes. Yeah.
It's what you do that matters.
Yes, I agree.
And throughout the 70s and 80s, particularly in chaos magic circles, you get a lot of people banging on about belief. And this is based on totally out-of-date psychology. Nowadays, there's a lot of very interesting religious studies coming out. Actually, belief isn't important at all. It's what people do.
Yep.
But you quite find people hold beliefs about something, and then you look at how they act, and they act completely differently.
See any?
I mean, it's the same in the well, it's the same in the political sphere too, right? I'm always saying praxis. What's your praxis, right? Because people can talk theory or what they think all day long, but unless they're applying that, I'm like, what's the use? Which is why in political spheres, I always come back to mutual aid, community care. What are we actually doing to help each other? I'm not that interested in theory unless it is in service of praxis. Yep. Yeah. Very cool. What is your current creative interest? What are you working on?
I'm working on a book called Yogini, Sex, Death, and Possession in Early Tantra, which is not going to be a kind of like, here's how to do it book.
Unfortunately.
It's a historical survey looking at a variety of textual sources about yoginis, which are a kind of supernatural, semi-divine, semi-demonic female spirit in classical tantra. That's between about the 6th to the 13th century. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and I'm going to do a book after that, but I think that's enough for now.
Cool. How about you, Rodney? What's your why or your current? I know your current creative pursuit is getting through these concerts,
really,
right?
Yeah, I have barely slept in like 2 weeks, just doing preparation for that, and jet lagged out of my mind. I'm amazed that I actually managed to stay awake all the way through this. But what's the why at the moment? Just to get to the end? No, I mean the why is the same to me, and it always has been. Some people ask why, and some people say why not. No.
Yeah.
No, my why has always been, like we said earlier, people say, well, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, why not? And let's do it.
Yeah.
The reason I didn't tour for a long time because I was ill and I was doing lots of corporate shit and making money and whatever. And then I would go to a concert and I'd see a band up there and go, fuck off, I can do that better. And I just, that's why I wanted to get on stage in the first place, because it was like, I can do that. So I do. So that's still my why, is like, if I can do it, I should be doing it. And
I think if I can,
go on.
Sorry,
go on, Phil.
No.
Interrupt me, God damn it!
I don't get many chances to interrupt you. Sorry, I was just gonna to a more magical point. I think that why is really important, and I think a strength we both had is we both got into magic before the internet. Because what happens nowadays is somebody will have this wacky idea to do a ritual, and they'll go on the internet and they'll get basically told you can't do that. And we both learnt magic before the internet, so there was nobody to tell us you can't do that. Either just fuck it, we're going to do it. Sorry, swearing. Or, but we didn't have this whole kind of like online community to tell us that you can't do that.
So that actually circles us all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, where we talked about not asking for permission to make magic, to make creativity, to put creativity out in the world, to live our lives, right? And especially in these times, I think that's important, and so, but I'm wondering, there needs to be, I'm not asking permission to do this thing I'm driven to do, but I still need to be aware that there's community out there, right? Because there are some people not asking permission and they're just seizing everyone's shit and breaking things, right? So what's the difference then between I'm not asking permission to follow this creative impulse I have, but I also still want to maintain awareness of the greater good, of community, that there's other people on the planet, other beings on the planet and in the cosmos, right? So there's no permission, but still connection. Do you have any thoughts on that, either of you?
We have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, how we started Pagan News is that Phil was involved with a community called Pagan Link originally, which was a way for very disparate pagan communities to connect. And he literally turned up on my doorstep one day to say, "Can you help me with this?" And that's how we met. That's how we got.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
we were doing a mass ritual. What was
that?
We were doing that thing,
Heal the Earth ritual. Yeah, that's how we got together.
Yeah.
He was organizing this locally and came to me and asked for my assistance. And I'm like, sure, let's do this. And so from the beginning, it was motivated entirely with a sense of a much greater and wider perspective of community and globally. And that was very much what we were about.
Yep.
We weren't doing this to go like, we weren't motivated by, hey, look at me, give me your money, because we didn't.
Yeah.
Well, that was a factor, I think.
Or it wasn't like, hey, look at us, we're so special and so wise, and you should listen to everything we say and do it our way.
Because that was obvious anyway,
But it was very much beyond that. It was very much trying to create a community and bring it together and be part of it as wide and as disparate as possible. And especially back then, that was unheard of, because the occult scene back in the 70s and the 80s was it was tiny compared to what it is now, but it was also extremely disconnected and very gate-kept a lot of the time. And people were like, I still find it weird that people come and say like, well, I'm a Wiccan and he's a ceremonial magician. Like, Wiccans don't do ceremonies? What the hell are you talking about?
Right.
This is the most nonsensical dividing line I've ever heard in my life. It's absurd.
Right.
But, that was very true. Owning a pack of Crowley's Thoth deck could get you kind of like ostracized in some circles, Being queer into the occult it was definitely a big no-no. You were evil, you were on the left-hand path. And, when I started to turn up at occult events wearing leather trousers and a feather boa, people would look at me strangely.
Right.
That's Phil Hine, God, he's weird, What we were very much aware of was that all this was changing. A lot of the old shit was being challenged, and we were part of that challenging process. So we were supporting other people who were challenging the old guard and also making some waves ourselves. But we were very much tied to a wider sense of community. And I used to go to all the pagan moots, particularly after we, publish somebody's complaining letter, and very often run into the person. We published your letter, and I'd get a lot of flack, and I was like, shit, I wish Rodney would do more of this as well, then he could get the flack as well. But I spent a lot of that time running around, going to conferences, going to outdoor events. I had a great time in many ways. So we were very much tied into a community, and I think you're quite right to raise this issue of on the one hand, there's going for it, and then you have to go for it within the context. Because a lot of time, if you're doing a big project, you need other people on board.
That's right.
You can't just piss everybody off.
Yeah, that's right.
You might
to. The other thing we're very,
you need people. You don't do things on your own. You need support.
That's right.
We were very aware of that, especially during the Satanic Panic, because we were continually telling people we have to unite, because we have this enormous united front who are devoted to bringing us down. to literally imprisoning
Yes.
us and stopping
Yes.
us. And so if you don't band together against that, you're screwed. You cannot
That's right.
revolt as an individual against that kind of enormous patriarchal capitalist machine that's bearing down on
That's
you to
right.
use you as a scapegoat. I mean, we've got plenty of historical references that shows that's what happens. And that was really
Yeah.
important.
There was
But I think,
a British
yeah,
politician. Sorry, go on.
corollary to that is we had a very, very low tolerance for bullshit. And
Yeah.
we tried to attack bullshit as much as we possibly could, because I think that for us, that was another thing that was holding us back, was that so much of the occult world, and it still is right today, is layer upon layer of absolute bullshit, driven by financial or ego or just pure stupidity and ignorance. And we weren't going to be repeating that. We were not going to be a part of continually, like Phil says, this, just regurgitating the same old crap over and over again without challenging it. And so we took a very scientific attitude and a very punk attitude as well to saying, like, we would challenge everything and say, well, okay, prove it. Don't come to us and say,
Yeah.
and any assertion you make, back it up. If you can't back it up, then we don't give a shit.
Oh, we did a lot. I was in a lot of different occult groups, so I kind of had my fingers in a lot of pies. But there were occult groups who wouldn't talk to each other. Like if you're in the Temple of Psychic Youth, a lot of like very straight Wiccans were like, "Oh God, the Temple of Psychic Youth, they're all weird, aren't they?" And it's going, "Well, I'm not weird, am I?" And they're kind of, "Okay, we won't quite answer that, Phil. You are a bit
Also,
weird."
it's kind of ironic. Any occultist calling another occultist weird is a beautiful exercise in irony.
Well, so just to bring this together, both of you are talking about not falling into the trap of false separations when what we need to be doing is supporting each other and working together to survive, really,
Yeah,
and
literally.
yeah. So I want to wrap this up. I want to thank both of you for being here, but I also want you to let people know where they can find you. So Rodney, what's a good website for you?
RodneyOrpheus.com. I'm the only
How about
Rodney
you,
Orpheus
Phil?
in the world. So if you just type Rodney Orpheus into Google, you'll get numerous places you can go to find me. And I'm very active on social media,
Awesome.
Facebook, Instagram, Bluesky, you name it. I'm everywhere. That's easy.
He is. He's just amazing. He's everywhere. My blog is
Enfolding.org.
I've neglected it horribly because I've been doing other things. But it's been up since 2009, and it's where I put all my deranged wibblings about whatever happens to be interesting me at any one moment. You can go on there. I've got a Substack newsletter which I put out every time I've got something interesting to say, which is not that often. And I'm also active on Blue Sky and Facebook.
Awesome.
I can send you all that crap later if you want.
Great. Sounds good.
Okay.
And as usual, folks can find me at thorncoyle.com. And I thank you all for joining us today. This was a great conversation. Thanks, Rodney and Phil.
Thank you so much.
Well, what did you think of that conversation with Phil Hine and Rodney Orpheus? Pretty wild, huh? What amazing history and longevity those two have together. And I appreciate the depth of their friendship and their playfulness with each other and their crankiness with each other. It was not a polished conversation, which I actually really appreciate. They were both pretty raw and just present in the conversation. And I hope you learned some things about magical history, and they gave you some food for thought about some actions we might be able to take now to boost our creativity and our connection to spirit. So thanks again for joining me. And thanks to all of you who listen and who share the podcast and who leave reviews. And thanks again, as always, to my Patreon supporters. You can support me at Patreon, patreon.com/Thorn Coyle. That's THORNCOYLE. I'm wishing you a magical, creative day.